Welcome, friends, and settle in, because tonight we listen for the echo of last words. Of all the things a person leaves behind, few are stranger or more haunting than the final sentence they speak before the silence takes them. Sometimes those words are ordinary, a small request, a murmur to a loved one, a complaint about the cold. But sometimes, whether by accident or by some design we cannot name, the last thing a person says turns out to be chilling, a line so ironic, so oddly prophetic, so serene or so defiant, that it seems to reach beyond the deathbed and touch something we do not fully understand. Tonight we walk among the graves of celebrities whose final words send a shiver down the spine, and we will stand at each resting place and speak those words aloud, and let them hang in the air the way they must have hung in the rooms where they were first spoken. Before we begin, let me be honest with you about the ground we are walking, because last words are slippery things. Some of the farewells we will hear tonight were witnessed by many and written down at once, and we can trust them as we trust any fact. Others come to us softened or sharpened by grieving families, by biographers hungry for a good ending, by the simple way a story grows in the retelling. Where a quote is doubtful or disputed, I will tell you so. Because a chilling last word does not need to be embroidered to move us, and the truth, even when it is plainer, is always the better companion on a walk like this. You will hear every kind of farewell tonight. You will hear the darkly ironic, the man who swore he had never felt better and was dead by morning, the general who mocked the enemy's aim an instant before it found him. You will hear the eerily prophetic and the serenely strange, the dying who looked past the faces at their bedside and spoke of something beautiful waiting just out of sight. You will hear the defiant, those who met death with a joke or a curse rather than a prayer. And you will hear the tender and the sorrowful, the ones whose last words break the heart precisely because they are so small. 30 souls wait for us across the whole of this journey. 30 graves and 30 final sentences. And tonight we will visit the first 15 of them, resting our attention on each in turn before moving gently on to the next. There is a reason these final sentences hold such power over us. A last word is the closing line of an entire human story, the final note struck before the instrument falls silent forever. And when that note happens to ring with irony or prophecy or defiance, it can feel almost as though the dying person were handing us a message from the very border of the undiscovered country. We lean in to hear it precisely because we know there will be nothing after. We will honor all of them the same way, by telling you who they were, how they came to that final moment, and what, as best the record can tell us, they actually said. So take my arm, and lower your voice, and let us begin where so many Hollywood stories end. In the quiet, manicured lawns of the City of Dreams, with a man whose parting shot was as dry as the drink that helped undo him. Let us begin at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, in the Garden of Memory, where the ashes of one of the coolest men who ever lived are kept behind a quiet wall. Humphrey Bogart was the very embodiment of hard-boiled Hollywood, the trench-coated hero of Casablanca and the Maltese Falcon, the winner of an Academy Award for The African Queen, and the husband of Lauren Bacall in one of the screen's great love stories. But by the mid-1950s, decades of heavy smoking and hard drinking had caught up with him, and he was diagnosed with cancer of the esophagus. The disease wasted the tough guy away to less than 80 pounds, and in his final months, he would be lowered downstairs in a dumbwaiter so that he could still greet the friends who came to see him, a martini within reach, until nearly the end. He died on the 14th of January, 1957, at the age of 57. The last words most often attributed to him are a piece of dry, self-mocking wit entirely in keeping with the man, for he is said to have remarked, "I should never have switched from scotch to martinis." Now, honesty compels me to tell you that this famous line is disputed, and some who were close to him remembered instead a tenderer farewell to Bacall as she left to collect their children, when he told her simply, "Goodbye, kid, hurry back," and was gone before she returned. Whichever it was, the chill is the same, a man joking or loving his way to the very edge of the dark. His widow placed a small gold whistle in the urn with his ashes, a nod to the famous line she had once purred to him on screen. "You know how to whistle, don't you?" To understand the chill of that parting line, you have to know the man who spoke it, for Bogart had spent a career teaching audiences that real toughness wears a wry smile. He was Sam Spade and Rick Blaine, the cynic with the buried heart, the one who told Ingrid Bergman, "Here's looking at you, kid," and sent her onto the plane. Off-screen, he lived just as hard, drinking and sparring with the best of them. And when he met the 19-year-old Lauren Bacall on the set of To Have and Have Not, a man twice her age, the two of them fell into a love that lasted until it killed him to leave her. The cancer that took him was diagnosed after a marathon surgery in the spring of 1956, and he faced the long decline that followed, with the same gallows humor he had given his characters, cracking jokes with the parade of famous friends, Sinatra and Tracy and Hepburn among them, who climbed the stairs to sit with him. That is why the martini line fits him so perfectly, and also why we should hold it loosely. For the men who write down a dying legend's words are not immune to the temptation to make them worthy of the legend. What is beyond dispute is the small gold whistle his widow tucked in beside his ashes, engraved with the words that had first drawn them together, a private joke sealed forever in the dark. He rests here now at Forest Lawn, cool to the last. Let us travel now across the country to Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, to a crypt that holds the ashes of one of Hollywood's fiercest and most formidable stars. Joan Crawford clawed her way from crushing poverty to the very summit of the film world, winning an Academy Award for Mildred Pierce and terrifying a new generation as the faded star in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. She was famous for her iron will and her refusal to bow to anyone, and the story of her death has become one of the most quoted deathbed scenes in all of Hollywood lore. As she lay dying of a heart attack in her New York apartment on the 10th of May, 1977, a devoted housekeeper knelt beside her bed and began to pray aloud for her soul. Crawford, the story goes, opened her eyes and snapped, "Damn it, don't you dare ask God to help me," and with that final act of defiance, she was gone. It is a chilling and perfectly Crawfordian exit, and it is beloved for exactly that reason. But I owe you the truth, and the truth is that this version comes chiefly from her daughter Christina's scorching memoir, and that the very caregiver who was present later insisted the real exchange had been far gentler, a soft "don't do that" rather than a snarl. Perhaps the legend simply fit the woman too well to die. Whatever her actual last breath carried, she was cremated and her ashes placed here at Ferncliff, beside her fourth husband, fierce even in the retelling. She had been born Lucille Lesueur into real poverty, and she never once forgot the cold of it, driving herself with a ferocity that both built her legend and, in the end, isolated her. From flapper to grande dame, she reinvented herself again and again, surviving the death of silent film, the loss of her MGM contract, and the cruelty of an industry that discarded aging women, clawing her way back each time. Her feud with Bette Davis on the set of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane became Hollywood folklore, two titans loathing each other in front of the cameras, and after marrying a Pepsi executive, she even took a seat on that company's board. But her last years were lonely and reclusive, and in the days before her death, she gave away her beloved little dog, as if quietly setting her affairs in order. This is where honesty matters most, because the snarling deathbed line that made her legend comes to us through her daughter's bitter memoir, Mommy Dearest. And the caregiver who was actually in the room remembered something softer and sadder, a woman gently waving off a prayer, not cursing it. Perhaps we have simply preferred, all these years, the version that matched the fighter we watched on screen. Either way, she was cremated and placed here at Ferncliff, in a cemetery that also holds Judy Garland and Malcolm X. Even her birth year is a matter of dispute, shaved down by decades of studio publicity, so that the very dates recorded near her ashes may never have been entirely true, a fitting final ambiguity for a woman who spent her life composing her own legend. She rests here now, daring the heavens still. Let us make our way now to Hollywood Forever Cemetery, to a grand marble monument set before a long, still reflecting pool, the resting place of the man who practically invented the movie hero. Douglas Fairbanks Sr. was the swashbuckling king of the silent screen, the original Robin Hood, Zorro, and Thief of Baghdad, a founder of United Artists, and for a time, with his wife Mary Pickford, half of the most famous couple on earth. But the coming of sound had dimmed his star, and age had begun to soften the athletic figure on which his fame was built. Refusing to accept the decline, and against the advice of his doctors, he threw himself into punishing exercise to reclaim his youthful physique. On the 12th of December, 1939, he suffered a heart attack and was put to bed. When his nurse asked how he was feeling, the great athlete looked up at her and said, with what must have seemed like reassurance, "I've never felt better." He died in his sleep hours later, at the age of 56, There are few last words more chilling in their irony. A man declaring his perfect health at the very threshold of the grave. His widow later moved his remains to this stately tomb at Hollywood Forever, where an inscription and a mirror-calm pool honor the fallen hero of a vanished age. In his prime, there was no bigger star on Earth, and no more thrilling one. Fairbanks practically invented the action hero, leaping from balconies and swinging from ropes with a grin, in The Mark of Zorro, in Robin Hood, in The Thief of Baghdad, doing his own breathtaking stunts before stunts even had a name. With his wife Mary Pickford, America's sweetheart, he reigned over Hollywood from their fabled mansion Pickfair, and together with Charlie Chaplin and D.W. Griffith, they founded United Artists to seize control of their own work. He even presided over the very first Academy Awards ceremony. But sound arrived and the swashbuckler aged, and Fairbanks, who had built everything on physical grace, could not bear to watch that grace desert him. His marriage to Pickford collapsed. He wandered restlessly abroad, and he punished his body with exercise, trying to outrun time itself. That is the shadow behind his final boast, the desperate insistence of a man who had always been the most alive person in any room that he had never felt better, spoken as his overtaxed heart prepared to stop. 2 years after his death, his widow moved him from a temporary crypt to this grand marble tomb at Hollywood Forever, with its long reflecting pool, a monument as theatrical as the life it honors. His son, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., would become a considerable star in his own right, and the elder Fairbanks was granted an honorary Academy Award the year after he died, a belated bow from the industry he had done so much to build. For all his fame, he had grown quietly convinced that his greatest days were behind him, and that unspoken despair may have driven those frantic, fatal workouts as surely as vanity ever did. He rests here now, forever the picture of vigor. Let us travel now to Calvary Cemetery in East Los Angeles, to the grave of a comedian whose laughter defined an era and whose final words were as sweet and simple as a child's. Lou Costello, the round, panicking, lovable half of Abbott and Costello, was one of the highest-paid entertainers in the world during the war years, and his Who's On First routine remains one of the most perfect pieces of comedy ever devised. But by the late 1950s, the great partnership had dissolved, and Costello's health, long troubled by rheumatic fever and a weakened heart, was failing fast. On the 3rd of March, 1959, 3 days short of his 53rd birthday, he was resting when he was brought a strawberry ice cream soda, a small treat he had been craving. He savored it, and then, according to those present, he smiled and said, "That was the best ice cream soda I ever tasted." A few moments later, his heart gave out, and the man who had made a nation laugh was gone. It is a last line of startling gentleness, the simple contentment of a small pleasure enjoyed at the very end, and there is something almost unbearably tender in its innocence. Behind the pratfalls, Costello carried a private grief that few of his howling audiences ever guessed at. He and Bud Abbott had risen out of burlesque to conquer radio, film, and the new medium of television. And during the war, their patriotism was legendary, selling tens of millions of dollars in war bonds in a matter of weeks. But in 1943, Costello's infant son drowned in the family pool just days before his first birthday, a wound that never healed, and the comic performed on that very night rather than disappoint an audience, weeping only after the show. His health, damaged by rheumatic fever, grew fragile, and by the late 50s, tax troubles and changing tastes had ended the great partnership and left him working alone. So, when he savored that simple strawberry soda and pronounced it the finest he had ever tasted, there was a whole life of hidden sorrow standing quietly behind the sweetness, a man who had known terrible loss finding genuine joy in a small, last, ordinary pleasure. That is what gives the line its ache. He was gone within moments, 3 days shy of his birthday, and he was laid to rest here at Calvary among the other departed players of Hollywood's golden years. The great routine, Who's On First, was so beloved that a recording of it was eventually enshrined at the Baseball Hall of Fame, a comedy sketch honored among the relics of the national game. Costello had made a fortune helping others laugh, yet his own life had been shadowed by terrible loss and by the slow, humiliating fade of a partnership that once ruled the airwaves, and in the pure sweetness of that final, ordinary treat, there is the sense of a man who had learned the hard way exactly how rare a simple good moment can be. He rests here now at Calvary, the laughter stilled but not forgotten. Let us journey now to Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, to the grave of the most popular entertainer of his generation. A man whose voice was the very sound of Christmas and whose final words came, fittingly, on a day of leisure. Bing Crosby sold hundreds of millions of records, won an Academy Award for Going My Way, and gave the world White Christmas, the best-selling single in history. He was also a passionate and skilled golfer, and it was on the golf course that his story ended. On the 14th of October, 1977, near Madrid, Spain, the 74-year-old Crosby played a full round of 18 holes, and by all accounts, he played it well. As he walked off the course toward the clubhouse, in good spirits and good company, he turned to his companions and said, "That was a great game of golf, fellas." Moments later, he collapsed from a massive heart attack and died almost at once. There is a strange grace to it, a man expressing simple satisfaction with a fine afternoon, utterly unaware that it was his last. The chill lying in how close contentment and death can stand to one another. For a generation, Bing Crosby's easy baritone was simply the sound of American life, drifting out of every radio and record player, warm and unhurried and utterly reassuring. He was a pioneer as much as a star, one of the first to master the intimate crooning that the microphone made possible, one of the first to record his programs on tape so he could spend more time doing what he loved, and what he loved, more than almost anything, was golf. He helped found one of the game's most famous celebrity tournaments, and played to a serious standard well into old age. On that October afternoon outside Madrid, the 74-year-old Crosby completed a full 18 holes against a pair of Spanish professionals, and by the accounts of those with him, he had played beautifully and was in wonderful spirits, teasing and laughing as they headed in. His last words were not a grand pronouncement, but the contented sigh of a man who had just spent a perfect day doing the thing he treasured, which is exactly what makes them linger, the reminder that the ordinary happiness of an afternoon can sit a single heartbeat away from the end. He collapsed on the path and was gone almost at once, and he was brought home to Holy Cross to lie beside his first wife. There was a private complexity behind the genial public warmth, a discipline and reserve his own children would later write about. But to the wider world he remained the unflappable everyman, forever ambling through life with a pipe and a tune. It seems somehow right that such a man should exit on a note of mild, understated satisfaction rather than high drama, strolling off a sunlit course with a compliment for the game on his lips, the curtain falling gently before he could possibly have known it was falling at all. He rests here now at Holy Cross, beside his first wife, the crooner at his ease. Let us travel now to Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, out in the California desert he loved, to the grave of the chairman of the board himself. Frank Sinatra was, quite simply, one of the defining voices of the 20th century, the swaggering, tender master of the American songbook, a movie star, and an Academy Award winner besides. He had sung of doing it his way and of the best being yet to come, projecting to the last an image of unshakable, cocksure command. But on the 14th of May, 1998, in a Los Angeles hospital, his great heart was finally failing him, and his wife Barbara, at his bedside, begged him to fight, to keep struggling for life. Sinatra looked at her and said, quietly, "I'm losing." They were his last words, and he died soon after, at the age of 82. What makes them chilling is the epitaph he chose for the stone that now marks his grave. 3 words, drawn from one of his own recordings: "The best is yet to come." There, carved in granite, is the eternal optimism of the performer, forever contradicted by the honest surrender of the dying man. He was buried with a bottle of whiskey, a Zippo lighter, a pack of cigarettes, and a handful of dimes, so that, some said, he could always call home. No performer ever wore invincibility more convincingly than Frank Sinatra. From the screaming Bobby Soxers of the 40s through the crushing comeback of From Here to Eternity, which won him an Oscar and resurrected his career, and on into the swaggering reign of the Rat Pack, he cultivated an image of a man wholly in command, of fate itself as much as of a song. He sang, "I did it my way, and the best is yet to come," and made a nation believe him, which is precisely why his true final words land so hard. Stripped of the tuxedo and the spotlight, an 82-year-old man in a hospital bed, his great heart failing, he answered his wife's desperate plea to keep fighting with 2 small, honest, devastating syllables: "I'm losing." There was no bravado left, only the plain truth. And when they carved his stone, they chose those defiant words from his own recording: "The best is yet to come," so that his grave forever argues with his deathbed. Optimism in granite, over surrender in the dark. They buried the chairman with the tokens of his life, a bottle of whiskey and cigarettes, and a lighter, and a pocket full of dimes, in case, they said, he ever needed to call. He had clawed his way back from a career the whole world had written off, and that hard-won knowledge of how quickly fortune can turn had only deepened his need to project total command. To hear that voice, which had filled arenas and defined an era, reduced at the very last to a whispered admission of defeat, is to be reminded that death is the one audience no performer has ever managed to charm, however perfect the song. He rests here now beneath the desert sky. Let us cross the sea now to the green hills of St. Anne, in Jamaica, to the village of 9 Mile, where a simple mausoleum holds a man revered around the world as a prophet as much as a musician. Bob Marley carried reggae out of Kingston and into every corner of the earth, singing of redemption, of love, and of standing up for one's rights, with a conviction that made him far more than a pop star. In 1977, a cancer was discovered beneath a toenail, a rare and aggressive melanoma, but Marley, a devout Rastafarian, refused the amputation his doctors urged, and the disease spread in time to his lungs, his liver, and his brain. As he traveled home toward Jamaica in the spring of 1981, his body finally failing, he stopped in Miami, and there, from his hospital bed, he is said to have spoken his last words to his young son Ziggy, telling him gently, "Money can't buy life." He died on the 11th of May, at only 36 years old. It is a final message of piercing clarity from a man who had gained the whole world and understood, at the end, exactly what it could not purchase. He was carried home and laid to rest here at 9 Mile, near the spot where he was born, buried according to tradition with his guitar, a Bible, and a soccer ball. Marley had risen from the brutal poverty of Trenchtown in Kingston to become the first global superstar the developing world ever produced, a man whose songs of resistance and redemption were sung from Africa to Europe to the Americas. With the Wailers, he had recorded anthems that outlived their moment. Get Up, Stand Up, Redemption Song, One Love, and he carried them with the conviction of a true believer, a man who meant every word he sang. He had already cheated death once, surviving an assassin's bullets in 1976, and he took the stage 2 nights later anyway, declaring that the people trying to make the world worse were not taking a day off, so how could he? When the melanoma was found beneath his toe, his refusal of amputation was not vanity but faith, a Rastafarian conviction that the body must remain whole, and he sought instead an experimental clinic in the mountains of Germany, while the cancer quietly spread. He collapsed at last while jogging in Central Park, and cut short his final tour, and set out for home he would never reach alive. That his last words to his son should strip away everything but the one truth wealth and fame could not touch, that money cannot buy life, is a fitting benediction from a man who had always sung as if he could see further than the rest of us. In the years since, 9 Mile has become a place of quiet pilgrimage, drawing travelers from every continent to the little green hillside where the boy who would move the world was born and now lies at rest. His music, if anything, has only grown larger in his absence, so that his final warning about the limits of wealth is carried now by millions of voices he never lived to hear. He rests here now, a prophet in his own country at last. Let us return now to Forest Lawn in Glendale, to the grave of a musician whose staggering talent was matched only by the senseless horror of how he lost his life. Terry Kath was the founding guitarist and one of the great voices of the band Chicago, a player so gifted that Jimi Hendrix himself is said to have called him one of the finest guitarists alive. He was also, tragically, a collector of firearms who did not treat them with the caution they demand. On the 23rd of January, 1978, at a party at a friend's house in Los Angeles, Kath had been drinking and began handling his guns, and as the other guests grew visibly nervous, he tried to put them at ease. Picking up a pistol and waving off their fears, he assured them, "Don't worry, it's not loaded," and to prove it, he raised the gun to his head and pulled the trigger, not realizing that a single round remained in the chamber. He was killed instantly, a week before his 32nd birthday. There are no more chilling last words than a fatal reassurance, a man promising safety in the very instant he destroyed himself, and his bandmates were so devastated that they nearly disbanded for good. It is one of the cruelest ironies in the history of rock and roll that a musician of such staggering gifts should be lost not to the stage or the road, but to a careless instant in a friend's living room. Kath was the soul of Chicago, the gritty, gospel-tinged voice and the fearless guitar behind the band's earliest and best work. On songs like 25 or 6 to 4, a player whose fluid, overdriven brilliance drew awe from the greatest of his peers. But fame had brought excess, and among his passions was a collection of firearms he handled with a casual recklessness that frightened those around him. On that January night, already drinking, he turned his roadie's worried warnings into a grim little demonstration, insisting the pistol was empty even as he raised it. The magazine had been removed, and perhaps that is what fooled him, but a single round remained chambered, and the demonstration meant to reassure the room ended his life in an instant. His bandmates were so shattered that they seriously considered ending the band entirely, and decades later, his own daughter would make a documentary, trying to understand the father she barely knew. He was laid to rest here at Forest Lawn, his enormous promise sealed off forever at 31. That reported praise from Hendrix, that Kath was the finest guitarist he knew, is the kind of tribute most musicians would trade a career to earn, which makes the manner of his loss all the harder to bear. There was no malice in that room and no despair in his heart. Only a fatal, casual confidence in a machine he did not respect enough. And decades on his bandmates still speak of him as the piece of Chicago that could never truly be replaced. He rests here now at Forest Lawn, a brilliant light put out by a moment's terrible mistake. Let us travel now to Alta Mesa Memorial Park in Palo Alto, to a grave you will not be able to find, for it bears no name at all. Steve Jobs was the visionary co-founder of Apple, the man whose restless perfectionism gave the world the personal computer, the iPod, and the iPhone, and who reshaped the way billions of people live. In 2003, he was diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer, and after years of treatment, he died at home, surrounded by his family, on the 5th of October, 2011, at the age of 56. It was his sister, the writer Mona Simpson, who shared his final moments with the world in a moving eulogy. She described how, in his last hours, Jobs looked for a long time at his wife and children gathered around him, and then looked past them, over their shoulders, towards something they could not see. And then, she said, he spoke his last words, 3 simple exclamations of what sounded like wonder. Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow. What he saw in that final moment, no one can say, and it is precisely that mystery that makes the words so haunting. At his own family's request, he lies here in an unmarked grave, near an orchard of apricot trees, his exact spot a secret the cemetery will not share, though admirers from around the world still come and leave their notes. Jobs had spent his life obsessed with the marriage of technology and beauty, a demanding, mercurial visionary who was cast out of the company he founded and then returned to lead it to heights no one imagined, giving the world a succession of objects, the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, that changed daily life on a planetary scale. He was also a man who thought hard about mortality, who once told a graduating class that remembering he would soon be dead was the most important tool he had ever encountered for making the big choices in life. When the cancer came, he battled it for 8 years with the same singular will he brought to everything, and he faced its final approach clear-eyed, surrounded by the family he loved. His sister's account of his last hour is almost unbearably tender. The long gaze at each of them, and then the gaze beyond them, at something in the distance none of them could perceive, before those 3 soft syllables of astonishment. Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow. He left no clue as to what he saw, and the not knowing is the whole of the chill, an ending that reads like either transcendence or the deepest mystery there is. In keeping with a life that guarded its private center fiercely, he lies in a grave with no marker at all, its location, a secret, a blank space where the most recognizable name of his age might have been. He had once told a hall full of graduates that death was very likely the single finest invention of life, the great agent of change that clears away the old to make room for the new, words that read very differently now that we know how his own end would come. Whatever waited beyond the circle of his family's faces, he met it, by his sister's account, with astonishment rather than fear. He rests here now, a wonder on his lips. Let us make our way now to Holy Cross Cemetery in Colma, California, to the grave of an American hero whose last words belonged not to the game that made him famous, but to the woman he never stopped loving. Joe DiMaggio was the Yankee Clipper, the picture of grace in center field, whose 56-game hitting streak still stands as one of the most untouchable records in all of sports. But to much of the world, he was known just as deeply for his brief, tempestuous marriage to Marilyn Monroe, and for the devotion he showed her even after their divorce and her death, sending fresh roses to her crypt several times a week for 20 years. He guarded her memory fiercely and never truly loved another. When DiMaggio himself lay dying of lung cancer in March of 1999, at the age of 84, those at his bedside recorded a final sentence of quiet, aching hope. "I'll finally get to see Marilyn," he said, and then he was gone. It is a last line that transforms a death into a reunion, and there is a tenderness in it that outshines every record he ever set. DiMaggio's greatness on the field was a matter of record: 9 championships in his 13 seasons, and a 56-game hitting streak in the summer of 1941 that has never been seriously threatened and may never be broken. But it was his love for Marilyn Monroe that made him a figure of aching legend. Their marriage lasted less than a year, undone by the collision of his old-fashioned pride and her incandescent fame. Yet he never stopped loving her, and when she died alone in 1962, it was DiMaggio who quietly claimed her body and arranged her funeral, barring the Hollywood crowd he blamed for her destruction. For 20 years afterward, he had roses delivered to her crypt several times each week, a vigil of devotion that outlasted every record he ever set. He guarded her memory in silence for the rest of his long life, and never married again. So when the old ball player, dying of cancer at 84, spoke of finally getting to see Marilyn, it was not sentiment but the settling of a decades-long ache, a reunion he seems genuinely to have believed was waiting for him. There are few last words that turn the grave so completely into a door. He rests here now at Holy Cross in Colma, his long wait, perhaps, at an end. He had been an intensely private and proud man, uneasy with the public grief that swirled around Monroe's death, and he spent the decades afterward saying almost nothing about her in public while speaking to her, it seemed, constantly in private. A famous song would ask where he had gone, casting him as a lost American ideal. But the truth was simpler and sadder. An old man carrying a torch he had lit in his 20s and never once set down, until his final sentence gave that lifelong devotion its last and quietest voice. He rests here now at Holy Cross, going at last to meet her. Let us cross the ocean now to England, to the churchyard of St. Martin in the little village of Bladone, in the shadow of the great palace where he was born, to the grave of the man who saved his nation. Winston Churchill led Britain through its darkest hour, his defiant voice rallying a people to stand alone against tyranny, and he was a soldier, a painter, and a Nobel Prize-winning writer besides. In old age, he had reportedly told those close to him that he would die on the 24th of January, the very date on which his own beloved father had died 70 years before, an eerie prophecy he seemed determined to keep. After suffering a severe stroke in January of 1965, the greatest orator of his age fell mostly silent, but his last coherent words, murmured to his son-in-law, carried a weary and very human note. "I'm so bored with it all," he said, and then slipped into a coma. He died days later, on the 24th of January, exactly as he had foretold. There is something profoundly chilling in that pairing. The titan who had faced down the fall of civilizations, confessing at the end only to boredom, and dying on the precise date he had marked. Churchill had lived one of the largest lives of the century, a cavalry officer and war correspondent turned statesman, a man twice made prime minister, whose growling, unyielding defiance in 1940 gave a besieged people the courage to stand alone against the darkness gathering over Europe. He had promised them only blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and vowed they would fight on the beaches and never surrender, and they had believed him, and it had been enough. He was a painter, and a bricklayer, and a Nobel laureate in literature besides, a force of nature who seemed too vast for ordinary death. Which is what makes his ending so quietly shattering. This colossus reduced at the last, after a devastating stroke, to a single weary confession that he was bored with it all, before the long silence closed over him. Stranger still is the matter of the date, for Churchill had reportedly told his daughter, years earlier, that he would die on the anniversary of his own father's death, the 24th of January, and die on that exact date he did, 70 years to the day. By his own wish, he was not entombed among the kings at Westminster but laid to rest in this modest country churchyard at Bladon, within sight of Blenheim Palace, where he had been born 90 years before, The circle of his enormous life quietly closed. He had painted hundreds of canvases and laid brick walls with his own hands to steady his restless mind. And he had lived to warn the world of a new Cold War even as the last great struggle ended. That such a man, who had stared down the collapse of empires, should sum up his final reckoning with existence in a single word of weariness is its own kind of chilling honesty, the quiet admission that even the grandest life, stretched long enough, can arrive at simple exhaustion. He rests here now at Bledon, near the palace of his birth. Let us travel now to the wooded grounds of the Glenmont Estate in West Orange, New Jersey, to a quiet family plot behind the home of the man who lit the modern world. Thomas Edison was the most prolific inventor in American history, the mind behind the practical electric light, the phonograph, and the motion picture camera, the holder of over 1,000 patents, the Wizard of Menlo Park. In his final years, his health declined, and by October of 1931 he was slipping in and out of a coma at Glenmont, his family keeping vigil at his side. In one of his last lucid moments, the old inventor stirred, and he lifted his eyes toward the window, gazing at something beyond the room, beyond perhaps the world itself. And to his wife Mina, softly, he said, "It is very beautiful over there." He died soon after, on the 18th of October, at the age of 84, and in tribute, a grieving nation briefly dimmed its lights. There is a strange and gentle comfort in his final words, and a chill, too, for the man who had spent his life illuminating the darkness seemed, at the last, to glimpse a light of an entirely different kind. No single person did more to build the modern world than Thomas Edison. From his laboratory at Menlo Park came a torrent of invention that still shapes every hour of our lives. The phonograph that first captured the human voice, the practical incandescent lamp that pushed back the night, the systems of power that lit whole cities, and the motion picture camera that taught the world to dream in the dark. He held well over 1,000 patents, and famously insisted that genius was mostly perspiration, working himself and his assistants to exhaustion in pursuit of the next breakthrough. By the autumn of 1931, the great inventor was 84 and fading, drifting in and out of consciousness at Glenmont while his wife Mina and the nation kept watch. In one of his last waking moments, he surfaced from the depths, turned his eyes toward the window and the light beyond it, and spoke, softly and with apparent wonder, of how very beautiful it was over there. What the man who had spent his life mastering light believed he glimpsed in that final brightness, we will never know. When he died, communities across the country dimmed their electric lights for a single minute in tribute, a darkness he himself had banished, briefly restored in his honor. He rests here now in the grounds of the home he loved. He had been very nearly deaf for most of his life, a loss he claimed only helped him concentrate, and he had approached even the question of an afterlife with an inventor's stubborn curiosity, tinkering in his final years with the notion of a machine that might reach the dead. Perhaps that lifelong hunger to know the unknowable is why his glimpse of something beautiful beyond the window carries such weight. The report of a man who had spent his days refusing to accept that anything at all was truly out of reach. He rests here now behind his beloved home, gazing still toward that beautiful somewhere. Let us travel now to the little Cornwall Hollow Cemetery in Connecticut, to a monument honoring a Union general whose last words have become the most darkly famous in American military history. John Sedgwick, affectionately known to his men as Uncle John, was one of the most beloved and capable corps commanders in the Army of the Potomac, a steady and trusted soldier through the long agony of the Civil War. On the 9th of May, 1864, at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, his men were flinching and ducking as Confederate sharpshooters fired at them from a distance, and Sedgwick, wishing to steady them, strode out among them and chided their caution. "Why are you dodging like this?" he scolded, laughing. "They couldn't hit an elephant at this dist." He did not finish the word. A sharpshooter's bullet struck him below the left eye, and he fell dead at the feet of the very men he had just reassured. It is perhaps the most chilling last sentence ever spoken, a boast cut in half by the exact fate it dismissed, and he became the highest-ranking Union officer to die in the entire war. Sedgwick was no reckless glory seeker, but a careful, methodical, deeply respected soldier, a West Point man who had served in Mexico and on the frontier before the Great War came, and who commanded the largest corps in the Union Army, with a steady competence that made him one of General Grant's most trusted lieutenants. His men adored him, which is exactly why he stepped into the open that morning, not out of bravado but out of a fatherly wish to calm soldiers who were flinching under long-range fire and, he feared, losing their nerve. The Confederate marksmen were perhaps 1,000 yards off, firing imported precision rifles, and as his troops ducked at the whistle of the bullets, Sedgwick chided them with affectionate exasperation, telling them they were ashamed of themselves, and that the enemy could not possibly hit anything at such a range, not even an elephant. The word died in his mouth as the bullet found him beneath the eye. Grant, when told, could scarcely believe it, asking again and again whether the report was truly correct, for the loss of Sedgwick struck him harder, he said, than the loss of a whole division. He remains the highest-ranking Union officer killed in the entire Civil War, felled by the very marksmanship he had just dismissed, and he was carried home to Connecticut and laid to rest here beneath a fitting monument. A statue of him was later raised at West Point, and generations of cadets have rubbed its spurs in a small superstition meant to ward off failure, so that the general undone by a single overconfident sentence became, in death, a charm against exactly that kind of pride. There is a grim and ancient lesson folded into his last words, that the very moment we feel most certain of our safety is often the moment we ought to be most afraid. He rests here, now, in his Connecticut home ground, forever mid-sentence. Let us travel now to the West Cemetery in Amherst, Massachusetts, to the family plot of a poet who spent her life contemplating death, and who described her own with the quiet precision of her verse. Emily Dickinson lived almost entirely within her family home, a recluse who left behind nearly 1,800 poems, most of them undiscovered until after she died, many of them circling again and again around the great mystery of mortality and eternity. She had spent a lifetime rehearsing death on the page, and when it came for her at last, on the 15th of May, 1886, she met it with the same startling clarity. Weakened by illness, slipping away, she is said to have spoken a final line of pure, luminous simplicity, an image as gentle and as final as any she ever wrote. "I must go in," she said. "The fog is rising." With that, the poet of Amherst stepped, as it were, indoors, out of the gathering mist, and into the dark she had studied so long. Her headstone bears 2 words she herself had chosen for the occasion. Called back. There is no more fitting last line for a poet of death than one that turns her own dying into a small, quiet, homeward step. Emily Dickinson had made death her lifelong subject, circling it in poem after poem with an intimacy that unnerves readers to this day. Imagining her own funeral, riding in a carriage with death as a courteous gentleman caller, listening for the buzz of a fly in the stillness of a deathbed. She wrote nearly 1,800 of these small electric poems in near total seclusion in her family home, sewing them into little hand-bound bundles that almost no one saw in her lifetime, so that the world only discovered her genius after her sister found the hidden trove following her death. Having rehearsed the great passage so many times in verse, she seemed, when her own hour arrived, to meet it with the same uncanny composure. Her final written words, in a brief note to her cousins, were only 2, called back, as if she were being summoned home, and her last spoken words turned her dying into one more of her perfect, understated images, the simple announcement that she must step indoors because the fog was rising, as though death were nothing more fearful than the cool damp of a New England evening driving a woman in from her garden. It is difficult to imagine a more fitting farewell from the poet who knew that country best. Her headstone, at her own instruction, bears only those 2 summoned words, called back. She was buried, by her own wish, in a white coffin carried out through the back door and across the blooming fields she loved rather than through the streets of the town, a final act of the fierce privacy she had guarded all her life. The poems she left hidden behind her, once the world at last discovered them, revealed a mind that had gazed longer and more steadily into mortality than almost any other, which is why her calm little farewell about the rising fog reads less like fear than like recognition, an old acquaintance finally arriving at the door. She rests here now in Amherst, gone in out of the fog. And so we come to the last grave of this first half of our journey, and it belongs, appropriately, to the greatest wit who ever lived, a man who could not resist a final joke even with the shadow upon him. Let us travel to the famous Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, to a great winged monument that for decades was smothered in the lipstick kisses of admirers. Oscar Wilde was the most brilliant conversationalist and playwright of his age. the author of The Importance of Being Earnest and The Picture of Dorian Gray, before scandal and imprisonment broke his health and his fortune and drove him into exile. He spent his final months in a shabby, cheap hotel room in Paris, dying in poverty of meningitis, and even then his celebrated wit did not desert him. Gesturing at the room's hideous, garish wallpaper, which he claimed to loathe, he delivered one of the most perfect last lines ever recorded, declaring that his wallpaper and he were fighting a duel to the death, and that one or the other of them would have to go. He died on the 30th of November, 1900, at just 46, defiant and laughing to the end. It is chilling in the most delightful way. A man staring down his own extinction and choosing, of all things, to make a joke about the decor. Wilde had been the most dazzling figure of his age, the apostle of art for art's sake, whose plays still sparkle, and whose conversation was said to be the finest in Europe. Then, at the very height of his fame, he was destroyed, prosecuted, and imprisoned under the cruel laws of his day, sentenced to hard labor that ruined his health, and released into an exile of poverty and disgrace under an assumed name. He wandered Europe as a broken man, and it was in a cheap Paris hotel room, deep in debt and dying of meningitis, that he spent his final days. Even then, the wit that had conquered London would not be silenced. He is supposed to have remarked that he was dying beyond his means, and, eyeing the room's dreadful wallpaper, to have declared that one of the two of them would simply have to go. To meet one's own extinction with a joke about interior decorating is a kind of courage most of us can only marvel at, a refusal to grant death the dignity of solemnity. He died at 46, received at the very end into the Catholic Church he had long circled. Years later, the sculptor Jacob Epstein raised the great winged monument that marks him now, a tomb so beloved that admirers kissed it for decades, until their lipstick began to corrode the stone, and a barrier of glass had to be raised around it. His devoted friend Robert Ross, who had stood by him through every disgrace, would eventually have his own ashes placed within the tomb, so that the two of them keep company still beneath the great stone wings. It is a strangely gentle ending for so tragic a story. The ruined genius transformed by the slow work of time into one of the most visited and most kissed graves in all of Paris. He rests here now beneath a great stone angel at Père Lachaise, his final quip immortal. And so, friends, we pause. We have heard the ironic and the tender, the prophetic and the defiant, the serene and the darkly, wonderfully funny. We have stood before the ashes of movie stars and the tombs of poets and generals, and at each one we have listened to a human voice speak its final sentence into the dark, and felt the small, cold thrill of how those words landed. But our walk is only half finished. 15 more graves lie ahead of us on this shadowed road, and 15 more chilling farewells wait to be spoken aloud, from kings and composers to outlaws and the doomed young. Notice, as you catch your breath, how many different ways there are to leave. One man insisted he had never felt healthier and was gone by morning, while another mocked the enemy's aim and was struck down mid-word. The two of them proof of how cruelly the world can answer our confidence. One dying poet described her own passing as a simple step in out of the fog, and one dying inventor gazed toward a light and called it beautiful, the two of them meeting the dark with an eerie, enviable calm. One aging ballplayer spoke only of a woman he had loved and lost, turning his grave into a door, and one great wit could not resist a joke about the wallpaper even as the end closed in. Some of these words were surely polished by the people who repeated them, and where I could I have told you so. But the strangeness of them survives the doubt, because the truth is that we are all, every one of us, walking toward a final sentence of our own, and we cannot know what it will be. That is why we listen so closely to theirs. So rest here a moment among these first 15, and let their voices settle. Catch your breath, and steady yourself. And when you are ready to go on, we shall continue together, deeper into the country of last words. Welcome back, friends, and step once more onto the shadowed road, for our journey is only half done. In the first part of our walk, we stood at 15 graves, and listened to 15 final sentences, the ironic and the tender, the serene and the darkly funny, spoken by movie stars and inventors, poets and generals. Now the path carries us further still, far beyond the manicured lawns of Hollywood and out across the whole sweep of history, into royal palaces and revolutionaries' jungles, into artists' studios and the cold stone of ancient cathedrals. The 15 souls who remain to us lived across 5 centuries and on 4 continents, and yet they are bound together by the same strange thread as those we have already visited. A final sentence that chills the blood, whether by its irony, its prophecy, its defiance, or its unbearable sadness. Let me remind you of the promise I made at the start, because it matters more than ever in this second half of our walk. The older a set of last words is, the more likely it has been polished, invented, or improved by the people who came after. And several of the farewells we are about to hear reach back hundreds of years, into an age when a good story mattered more than a strict fact. Where a quote is doubtful, where it drifts toward legend rather than record, I will tell you plainly, and you can weigh it as you wish. But I would ask you to notice something as we go, that even the words we cannot fully trust still carry a truth of their own, for we do not invent last lines at random. We invent the ones that feel right, the ones that fit the life, and in that sense, even a legend is a kind of confession, the shape a person's death took in the memory of those who loved or feared them. Notice too, as we go, how the character of a life so often shapes the character of its final words. The wits die joking, and the fighters die defiant. The anxious die afraid, and the artists die reaching for beauty, or drowning in despair, as though the long habits of a whole existence gather themselves for one last, concentrated expression before the end. A queen dies apologizing for her manners. A philosopher dies mocking his god. A painter who never knew happiness dies pronouncing sadness eternal. That is part of what makes these farewells so haunting, the sense that in them a person becomes, for one final instant, the purest distillation of everything they were. So gather your resolve, and lower your voice once more, and let us walk on together, deeper into the country of last words, beginning with the man widely called the greatest genius who ever lived, and the harsh and startling verdict he is said to have passed upon himself at the very end. Let us begin this second half of our journey in the Loire Valley of France, at the Château d'Amboise, in the small and lovely chapel of Saint-Hubert, where the presumed remains of Leonardo da Vinci have rested for 5 centuries. Leonardo was the very definition of genius, the painter of the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, an anatomist, an engineer, a dreamer of flying machines centuries before their time, a mind so vast it seems scarcely to have belonged to a single man. In his final years, he had left Italy to live in France as the honored guest of King Francis I, who is said to have adored the old master, and to have given him a manor house near the royal chateau in which to spend his last days in peace. Leonardo died there on the 2nd of May, 1519, at the age of 67. And here the record gives way to legend, for it is said that he died cradled in the arms of the king himself, and that his final words were not a boast but a confession of failure, an admission that he had offended God and mankind because his work had not reached the quality it should have. Consider the chill of that, if it is true. The most gifted human being who ever lived, judging his own staggering life's work and finding it wanting, unfinished, not good enough. We must hold the words loosely, for they come to us from a biographer writing decades later, with every reason to shape a beautiful ending. But whether Leonardo truly despaired of his genius or not, his grave is itself a final riddle worthy of the man, for the original church that held him was destroyed in the French Revolution, his bones scattered and lost, and the tomb that bears his name today remains only presumed to be his. So much about Leonardo has always hovered between fact and legend, which makes it strangely fitting that his death and his grave should be uncertain too. He left behind thousands of pages of notebooks written in his backwards, mirror image hand, filled with anatomical drawings, war machines, and flying contraptions dreamed centuries too early, and yet he finished only a handful of paintings, abandoning far more than he ever completed, forever chasing a perfection that outran him. That lifelong dissatisfaction is exactly why the confession attributed to him rings true to those who love him, and exactly why we should be careful, for the biographer who recorded it, and who gave us the tender image of Leonardo dying in the arms of a king, was writing romance as much as history, and the king in question was very likely nowhere near. A stroke had withered his right hand in his final years, silencing the greatest draftsman who ever lived. When the church that first held his body was torn apart in the chaos that followed the revolution, his bones were scattered and mingled with others, and it was only decades later that a scattering of remains was gathered up and reburied under his name. so that even now scholars chase his DNA in the hope of proving that the man beneath the stone is truly him. He rests here now, or so we believe, a mystery to the last. Let us travel now, across the Channel to London, to the soaring vaults of Westminster Abbey, to a single tomb that holds two queens who spent their lives as bitter rivals. Elizabeth I was one of the mightiest monarchs England ever knew, the Virgin Queen who ruled for nearly 45 years, who saw off the Great Spanish Armada and presided over a golden age of Shakespeare and exploration and glory. Yet her final days, in the spring of 1603, were shadowed by a deep melancholy, a grief for the friends and favorites she had outlived, and by regret, it was said, for having sent her own cousin and others to their deaths. She died at Richmond Palace on the 24th of March, and the rumor that has clung to her ever since gives her a last line of aching, universal longing. "All my possessions," she is supposed to have said, for a moment of time. Consider the chill of it. The most powerful woman in the world, mistress of a kingdom and an empire in the making, willing at the end to trade every crown and jewel she owned for a single extra moment of life. Now, honesty compels me to tell you that historians regard these words as almost certainly apocryphal, a fitting invention rather than a recorded fact. But the true chill lies in her grave itself. For Elizabeth was laid in Westminster Abbey directly atop the coffin of her half-sister Mary, the Catholic queen she had feared and opposed in life, the two rival sisters sealed together for eternity beneath an inscription that calls them partners in throne and grave, sleeping in the hope of one resurrection. They had called her Gloriana and Good Queen Bess, and she had made herself the very symbol of England, declaring that though she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, she had the heart and stomach of a king. She never married, insisting she was wedded to her realm, and she steered her nation through decades of danger. Most famously, the summer the Great Spanish Armada came and was scattered. But the woman who died in that drafty palace was a shadow of the icon, sunk in a melancholy so deep that she reportedly refused for days to lie down or to eat, standing propped on cushions and staring at nothing, haunted, some said, by the memory of the favorite she had sent to the executioner's block. That is the ghost behind her rumored plea to trade all her possessions for a single moment more. And though scholars are confident the line was invented, the longing in it feels honest enough for any mortal, let alone a dying queen. Her successors spent a small fortune on the marble effigy that lies above her now, and it is her face alone that visitors see, though her coffin was lowered directly onto that of the Catholic half-sister she had feared and defied, so that the two enemies keep each other company through the centuries. She rests here now, reconciled in death with the enemy of her life. Let us travel now to the very heart of Paris, to the great domed Panthéon, the solemn mausoleum where France enshrines her immortal heroes, to the tomb of the sharpest wit the Enlightenment ever produced. Voltaire was the towering philosopher, playwright, and satirist who spent his long life battling superstition, tyranny, and above all the power of the Church, championing reason and tolerance with a pen that kings and bishops alike had cause to fear. He died in Paris on the 30th of May, 1778, at the great age of 83, and even on his deathbed the old skeptic could not resist one final thrust. As he lay dying, the story goes, a priest leaned close and urged him to renounce Satan and turn at last to God, and Voltaire, opening his eyes, is said to have replied that this was surely no time to be making new enemies. It is a perfect last line, defiant and funny and entirely in character. A man refusing to surrender his lifelong irony even at the threshold of eternity, and I will only remind you that its very perfection is reason to suspect the polish of legend. What is beyond doubt is the strange journey of his body, for the Church, which he had mocked so mercilessly, denied him a proper burial, and his friends had to smuggle his corpse out of the city and inter it quietly in a country abbey. Only years later, when the revolution made him a hero, was he brought back in triumph and laid to rest here in the Pantheon, his enemies outlasted at the last. He had written Candide and 100 other works, had been beaten, imprisoned in the Bastille, and driven into exile for his relentless mockery of the powerful, and he had made a rallying cry of the phrase, "Crush the infamous thing," by which he meant the intolerance and cruelty he saw dressed in the robes of religion. He had also, in his final months, returned in triumph to a Paris that greeted him as a living god, an old man of 83, nearly crushed by the adoration of the crowds, and it may have been the sheer exhausting glory of that homecoming that finished him. The deathbed scene, with the hovering priest and the perfectly aimed refusal to make new enemies, is too neat to trust entirely, but it is entirely in keeping with a man who armored himself in wit. Because the church he had tormented denied him holy ground, his relatives resorted to a grim subterfuge, propping his corpse upright in a carriage as though he were merely a sleeping passenger and smuggling it out of the city to a quiet abbey. Only when the revolution crowned him a hero of free thought was he carried back through enormous crowds and laid to rest beneath the dome of the Pantheon, directly across from his great rival Rousseau, the two of them arguing, perhaps, for eternity. He rests here now among the glories of France, still, one imagines, unwilling to make new enemies. Let us cross the ocean now to Philadelphia, to the old Christ Church burial ground, to a simple flat stone forever scattered with pennies, the grave of one of the most ingenious minds America ever produced. Benjamin Franklin was the closest thing the young nation had to a universal genius, a printer, a scientist who tamed the lightning, a diplomat who helped win a revolution, an inventor and a statesman, and a sage whose wit filled almanacs and whose signature sits on the founding documents of a country. He died in Philadelphia on the 17th of April, 1790, at the age of 84, his body at last worn out by long illness. In his final hours, as he struggled for breath, his daughter gently suggested that he shift his position in the bed so that he might breathe more easily and rest a little more comfortably. And Franklin, ever plain and ever honest, gave her an answer of quiet, unanswerable finality. "A dying man," he told her, "can do nothing easy." There is a chill in the sheer, clear-eyed acceptance of it, the most resourceful mind of his age, acknowledging that here, at last, was a problem no cleverness could solve, a passage that must simply be endured. The words are attributed rather than certain, but they fit him as well as his spectacles. He had drawn lightning down a kite string and tamed it with the rod that still guards our rooftops, had invented bifocals and a better stove, had printed the homely wisdom of Poor Richard's almanac, and had crossed an ocean to charm a king's court into saving a revolution. When he died, some 20,000 mourners are said to have filled the streets of Philadelphia to see him go, an outpouring for the most beloved American of his age. In his younger days, he had even composed a playful epitaph for himself, imagining his body as the worn-out cover of an old book, its contents not lost but destined to appear once more in a new and more perfect edition, revised and corrected by its author. But when the actual moment came, worn down by illness and struggling for each breath, there was no wit left to spare, only the plain, unadorned truth handed to his daughter, that for a dying man there is simply no easy way to lie. He asked in the end for no grand monument, only a simple, flat stone beside his wife Deborah, and that is what marks him still. Though visitors cannot resist tossing their pennies down upon it, a small, coppery tribute to the man who taught a nation that a penny saved was a penny earned. There is a strange comfort in the thought that even Franklin, who had bent the lightning itself to his will and outwitted the cleverest men of two continents, came at last to the one door that no invention could ease open, and chose to pass through it armed with nothing grander than the plain truth. He rests here now beneath his modest stone, exactly as he wished, while visitors toss their copper pennies down in tribute to the man who taught them that one saved was one earned. Let us travel now to the north of Paris, to the great Basilica of Saint-Denis, the ancient burial place of the kings and queens of France, to the tomb of a queen whose final words were an act of pure, reflexive grace in the shadow of the blade. Marie Antoinette had been the glittering, extravagant queen of France, blamed by a starving nation for its miseries, whether justly or not, and swept up at last in the fury of the revolution. Her husband, the king, was executed, her children taken from her, and after months of imprisonment and a sham of a trial, she was condemned to die. On the 16th of October, 1793, she was carried through jeering crowds to the guillotine, and as she climbed the steps of the scaffold, frightened but composed, she happened to tread upon the foot of her executioner, and the doomed queen, out of a lifetime of ingrained courtesy, turned to the man who was about to kill her and apologized, saying simply, "Pardon me, monsieur, I did not do it on purpose." There is a chill in that small, absurd, heartbreaking politeness, an apology offered to an executioner in the last seconds of a life, manners outliving hope itself. These words are well attested, and they may be the truest measure of her we have. Her body was thrown at first into an unmarked common grave, but after the monarchy was restored, her remains were sought out and gathered up. And in 1815, she was reinterred here at Saint-Denis, beside the husband she had followed to the blade. A queen returned at last to the company of kings. She had come to France as a girl of 14, an Austrian archduchess married off to seal an alliance, and she had never truly been understood by the people she was sent to rule. History has hung a cruel and almost certainly false quotation about cake around her neck, and blamed her extravagance for miseries that ran far deeper than any queen could cause. And by the time the revolution came for her, she had already lost her crown, her husband, and her children to it. Stripped of everything, her hair shorn, dressed in plain white, the once dazzling queen was paraded through screaming crowds in an open cart to the scaffold in the great square. The night before, she had written a last heartbreaking letter to her sister-in-law, proclaiming her innocence and grieving to leave her children forever. And then, at the very end, that small stumble on the executioner's foot and the reflexive, courteous apology, manners so deeply ingrained that they surfaced even in the final seconds of her life. Her body was flung into a common grave and dusted with quicklime, seemingly lost forever, until, after the monarchy returned, searchers dug through the earth, identified her remains as best they could, and carried her here to Saint-Denis to lie among the kings and queens of France at last. She rests here now, forgiven and forgiving. Let us travel now to the green banks of the Potomac River in Virginia, to the family tomb at Mount Vernon, to the grave of the man who fathered a nation and who feared, above almost all things, the horror of waking in his own coffin. George Washington had commanded the ragged army that won American independence, and had then, twice, been chosen to lead the new republic he had helped to create, before retiring at last to the plantation he loved. In December of 1799, he took a chill that settled into a savage infection of the throat, and the brutal medicine of the age, which bled him again and again, only hastened his end. As he lay dying on the 14th of December, at the age of 67, the great man gave his secretary a set of careful and revealing instructions. "Have me decently buried," he said, "but do not let my body be put into the vault in less than 3 days after I am dead." It was the voice of a very old and very common terror, the dread of premature burial, the fear of being sealed alive in the dark, and the founder of a country was not immune to it. A little while later, having satisfied himself that all was arranged, he spoke his actual final words, 2 syllables of quiet acceptance. "'Tis well," he murmured, and was gone. There is a chill in the pairing. The fearless general who had ridden through storms of musket fire, making certain, at the very end, that he would not be buried before he was truly dead. He had been the indispensable man of the American founding. The general who held a starving army together through impossible winters, the leader who could have made himself a king and instead handed power back to the people, twice, setting a precedent that shaped the republic forever. His death came with brutal speed, a sore throat on a cold December morning swelling within a day into an infection that closed his airway, while the doctors of the age, believing they were helping, drained away enormous quantities of his blood. He faced it with the same steadiness he had shown under fire, calmly arranging his affairs, and even, near the end, reaching to feel his own fading pulse. The fear he confessed, that he might be entombed too soon, was no strange eccentricity but a widespread terror of his century, an age that told grim stories of scratch marks found inside reopened coffins, so that some people were buried with bells and breathing tubes just in case. That the calm and fearless father of his country shared this one deep dread makes it all the more human. So great was his stature that Congress later built a crypt in the very heart of the Capitol to hold him, but his own wish was to remain here on his own land above the Potomac, and so the crypt beneath the nation's dome stands empty to this day, waiting for a body that never came. He rests here now, in the tomb at Mount Vernon, above the river, his 3 days long since kept. Let us cross the sea again to Vienna, the city of music, to the vast central cemetery where the great composers lie in honored ground, to the grave of the deaf titan who changed music forever. Ludwig van Beethoven had scaled heights no composer had ever reached, and he had done the impossible, composing some of his mightiest and most transcendent works while sunk in total deafness, hearing the music only in the silence of his own skull. He died in Vienna on the 26th of March, 1827, at the age of 56, and legend insists that he died in defiance, that as a violent thunderstorm broke over the city, a great clap of thunder roused him, and that he raised a clenched fist toward the heavens and then fell back dead. His last spoken words are genuinely disputed, and I will give you the versions honestly. Some say he quoted an old theatrical line telling those gathered to applaud, "Friends, for the comedy is over." Others say that when a long-awaited gift of fine wine arrived too late for him to enjoy, he sighed that it was a pity too late. And a tender legend holds that the man who had lived so long in silence promised, at the very end, that he would hear again in heaven. Whichever is true, there is a piercing chill in that last idea, the deaf master going to his grave in the certain hope of finally, at last, hearing. He had given the world 9 symphonies that still shake concert halls to their foundations, had set a poem of universal brotherhood to the soaring music of the 9th, and had done it all while the cruelest fate imaginable for a musician closed over him, a deafness that began in his 20s and deepened into total silence. Once, having conducted the premiere of that very 9th symphony, he had to be gently turned around by one of the singers to see the audience roaring and weeping and waving their handkerchiefs, because he could not hear a sound of the ovation he had earned. Years earlier, in despair at his encroaching deafness, he had written a trembling letter contemplating ending his own life, and had chosen instead to live for the art that still burned in him. So, when the storm broke over Vienna on the day he died, and legend has him raising a defiant fist at the thundering sky, it feels like the fitting last gesture of a man who spent his life shaking his fist at fate. His true final words are lost to certainty, scattered among competing accounts, but the loveliest of them, the deaf master's serene promise that he would hear again in heaven, is the one the world has chosen to remember, and who could blame it? Tens of thousands lined the streets for his funeral, the young Schubert among the torchbearers. The city that had so often neglected and misunderstood him in life gave him, in death, a funeral procession fit for an emperor, tens of thousands crowding the streets to follow the coffin of the difficult, thunderous, half-mad genius they had failed to cherish while they still could. He rests here now among Vienna's immortals, the silence perhaps broken. Let us travel now to Père Lachaise in Paris, the most famous cemetery in the world, to the grave of the poet of the piano, whose terror of the tomb led to one of the most chilling final requests ever made. Frédéric Chopin was the frail, brilliant Polish composer whose nocturnes and preludes remain among the most beloved music ever written, an exile in Paris who poured a whole country's longing into the keys. Tuberculosis had wasted him for years, and by the autumn of 1849 he knew the end was near. He died in the early hours of the 17th of October, at just 39 years old. But it was the request he made as death approached that sends the true shiver down the spine, for Chopin, like so many of his time, was gripped by a horror of being buried alive, of waking sealed beneath the earth, and so he begged those around him to make absolutely certain he was dead before they buried him, pleading with them, in his terror, to have his body cut open and his heart removed so that there could be no doubt at all. His wish was carried out. His heart was taken from his body, sealed in a jar of what was likely cognac, and smuggled by his devoted sister across 1,000 miles into his occupied homeland, where to this day it remains sealed within a pillar of a church in Warsaw, while his body rests here at Père Lachaise beneath a bed of Polish soil. He had been a frail and sensitive prodigy, a Pole exiled in Paris who could conjure entire landscapes of longing out of a keyboard, whose nocturnes and preludes and ballades remain among the most tender and heartbreaking music ever written. Tuberculosis had haunted him for most of his short life, wasting him slowly, and by his final months he weighed almost nothing and could barely cross a room without collapsing. But it was the shape of his fear that has echoed down the years, for the horror of premature burial that gripped his whole anxious century gripped him with particular force, and as death approached he could not rest until he had extracted a promise that his lifeless body would be opened and examined, that his heart itself would be cut out, so that no one could bury him while a spark of life remained. The macabre request was honored to the letter. His heart was removed, sealed away in a jar of spirits, and carried in secret by his grieving sister across 1,000 miles of hostile borders back to their beloved, occupied homeland, hidden, some say, beneath her skirts to escape the searching hands of the Russian authorities. There it remains, walled inside a pillar of a Warsaw church, a nation's relic, While his body lies here in Paris beneath a handful of Polish soil, a man split between the country that made him and the country that claimed him. He rests here now, divided between two lands, forever certain of his death. Let us travel now to Baltimore, to the old Greenmount Cemetery, to an unmarked patch of earth in a family plot, the grave of a famous actor who threw away his fame to become the most infamous assassin in American history. John Wilkes Booth was a celebrated and handsome stage performer, the toast of theaters across the country, when he chose instead to murder a president. On the night of the 14th of April, 1865, he shot Abraham Lincoln and fled into the dark, becoming the object of the greatest manhunt the nation had ever seen. 12 days later, he was cornered in a Virginia tobacco barn, which his pursuers set ablaze to flush him out, and a soldier fired a single shot that struck him in the neck and severed his spine, paralyzing him utterly. He lingered for some 3 hours as the life drained out of him, and at the very end, he asked that his own hands be lifted up before his eyes. He gazed at them, those hands that had fired the fatal shot and now could not so much as move at his command, and he whispered his final word twice. "Useless," he said. "Useless." There is a dark and complicated chill in it, whether he meant his ruined body or the whole ruinous act that had brought him there. His family, fearing that a marked grave would be desecrated, laid him in the family plot without a stone of his own, and to this day, visitors leave Lincoln pennies at the site, as if to give the murdered president the final word. He came from the most celebrated acting family in America, the son and brother of legendary tragedians, and he had been a matinee idol in his own right, wealthy and adored, before he traded all of it for a place in history as a murderer. He had first plotted merely to kidnap the president, and only in the final desperate days of a lost war did the scheme curdle into assassination. After firing the shot in the crowded theater and leaping to the stage, breaking his leg in the fall, he vanished into the countryside and led his pursuers on a frantic chase across Maryland and Virginia, scribbling in a pocket diary all the while, still convinced he had done something noble. When the soldiers finally trapped him and set the barn alight, the bullet that found him left him able to speak but unable to move, and he lay for hours contemplating the ruin of his own body and his cause alike before those two whispered words. There is a strange and terrible footnote to the family story, for his own brother, the great and gentle actor Edwin Booth, had once, by pure chance, saved the life of Abraham Lincoln's son on a crowded train platform, a good deed shadowed forever by his brother's crime. Fearing his grave would be torn apart by an outraged nation, the family buried him without a marker, and there he lies still, unnamed beneath the pennies visitors leave to keep the murdered president's memory upon him. He rests here now, nameless in the ground. Let us cross the ocean once more to London, to the leafy slopes of Highgate Cemetery, to a grave crowned by a massive bronze head that gazes out over the city, the resting place of a philosopher whose ideas would remake the world. Karl Marx spent his life in study and argument and exile, a stateless revolutionary who labored for decades in the reading room of the British Museum, producing the writings that would inspire revolutions and reshape the 20th century long after his death. By the spring of 1883, he was a broken man, ground down by illness and by the recent deaths of his beloved wife and his eldest daughter, and on the 14th of March, his housekeeper found him slipped away in his armchair. But a story attaches to his final hours that is too fitting to omit, for it is said that shortly before the end, his devoted housekeeper, sensing that history was watching, asked the great man whether he had any last words she might record for posterity. And Marx, the man of a million words, who had filled thousands of pages and would fill the mouths of millions more, turned on her with weary irritation and snapped that last words were for fools who had not said enough. It is a defiant and darkly funny refusal, a thinker declining to perform one final tidy quotation for the ages, and the words are attributed rather than certain. His once modest grave is now marked by that great brooding bronze bust, a place of pilgrimage and of protest, occasionally attacked by those who hate what he wrote. He had spent his life in libraries and lodging houses, an exile shuffled from country to country, poor enough that some of his own children died for want of proper care, laboring year after obsessive year over the vast analysis of capital and history that would, long after his death, inspire revolutions that remade half the globe. By the time the end came, he was a grief-stricken and exhausted man, hollowed out by the recent deaths of his wife and his eldest daughter, The two losses that friends said finally broke his will to live. His lifelong collaborator would stand at the small graveside and declare that the greatest living thinker had ceased to think, a loss whose full weight the world could scarcely yet imagine. The story of his impatient last retort, his refusal to hand his devoted housekeeper a tidy quotation for the history books, may well be too perfect to be strictly true, but it captures something real about a man who had already committed his life's meaning to millions of printed words and had no patience for a neat deathbed epigram. In the years since, his once humble grave has been crowned with an enormous glowering bronze head and become a site of pilgrimage, and more than once a target, damaged by pipe bombs and hammers wielded by those who still, more than a century on, hate what he wrote. He rests here now, having said, he clearly felt quite enough. Let us travel now to the quiet village of Auvers-sur-Oise, north of Paris, to a small cemetery where two simple ivy-covered graves lie side by side, the resting place of a painter the world ignored in life and worshipped only after his death. Vincent van Gogh had spent his brief career in poverty and torment, selling almost nothing, sustained through everything by the unwavering love and support of his younger brother Theo. In the summer of 1890, in the fields around Auvers, where he had painted with feverish energy, Vincent suffered a gunshot wound to the chest, by the traditional account inflicted by his own hand, and he lingered for 2 days as his life ebbed away. Theo rushed to his side and held him through his final hours, and it was to Theo, according to the account that has come down to us, that Vincent spoke his last, heartbreaking words. "The sadness," he said, "will last forever." There is almost no chill sadder than that one. A final verdict of despair from a man whose paintings now blaze across the world with the most passionate color and light and life that art has ever known, adored by millions who never bought a single canvas while he lived. The words come to us through his grieving brother, and some scholars now even question the manner of his death. But the sorrow of that farewell is beyond dispute. Theo, who could not bear to live without him, died only 6 months later, and the two brothers lie here together beneath a shared blanket of ivy. In barely a decade of feverish work, he produced some 2,000 drawings and paintings, canvases that now hang as the most treasured objects in the world's great museums, and in his own lifetime he sold almost none of them, kept alive in body and spirit only by the loyal younger brother who sent him money and encouragement and love without fail. His had been a life of torment, of the famous wound to his own ear, of breakdowns and asylums, and a mind that would not let him rest, and yet he painted the night sky and the sunflowers and the wheat fields with a joy and a violence of color that no one had ever seen before. In the fields outside Auvers that July, he received the gunshot wound that would kill him, and by the account that has come down to us, he staggered back to his little room at the inn and lingered for a day and more, until his brother could reach him and hold him at the end. Some scholars now argue that the wound may not have been his own doing at all, that the truth of that afternoon is murkier than the legend allows, and we may never know for certain. But the words his brother carried away from that bedside, the flat and final verdict that the sadness would last forever, are almost unbearable coming from the man whose work would one day fill the world with beauty. Theo, unable to live without him, followed within months, and the two brothers were laid side by side. He rests here now beside the brother who loved him. The sadness, one hopes, finally ended. Let us cross to the windswept coast of Wales, to the little churchyard of St. Martin in the village of Lafarne, to a plain white wooden cross that marks the grave of a poet who raged against the dying of the light and then met it far too soon. Dylan Thomas was the wild, roaring, magnificent voice of Welsh poetry, a man whose thunderous readings and hard living made him as famous for his appetites as for his art. In the autumn of 1953, on a lecture tour of America, the 39-year-old poet collapsed in New York City and died a few days later. And the legend that immediately grew up around his death gave him a final boast perfectly suited to his reputation. The claim that shortly before he fell, he had announced, with a kind of grim pride, that he had drunk 18 straight whiskeys in a row, and that he believed that was the record. It is a chilling and darkly funny last line, a poet toasting his own excess in the very act of being destroyed by it, and it has been repeated for 70 years. But here honesty must do its work. For modern research strongly suggests that the whiskey boast was wildly exaggerated, and that Thomas died not of drink alone but of pneumonia and a badly mishandled illness. The legend, in other words, may be just that. Yet it endures because it feels true to the man, and that is its own kind of epitaph. He had written some of the most incantatory poetry of the century. The villanelle urging his own dying father to rage against the dying of the light, the radio play that wandered through the dreams of a small Welsh town, and he had performed it all in a booming, theatrical voice that made him a transatlantic celebrity, filling American lecture halls and draining American bars. He lived hard and drank harder, and the legend of his death was built to match, the boast of 18 whiskeys becoming an instant epitaph for a man who seemed to burn himself down in public. But the truth, teased out by later researchers, is quieter and sadder and more ordinary. A serious chest infection compounded by pneumonia and very possibly by the drugs a doctor gave him, and by an undiagnosed condition, so that the great drinker may in the end have been killed less by the bottle than by a failure of care. The famous number, in all likelihood, was exaggerated in the retelling, almost as it left the barroom. And yet the legend has outlived every correction, because it is the death the world wanted for him, dramatic and self-destructive and quotable, and there is a lesson in that, about how easily we trade a difficult truth for a satisfying story. He lies now beneath a plain white cross above the estuary at Laugharne, where he had done his best writing in a little shed by the water. He rests here now beneath his simple cross in the Welsh earth he loved, the record, real or not, unbroken. Let us travel now to the city of Santa Clara in Cuba, to a solemn mausoleum beneath an eternal flame, the resting place of a revolutionary whose face became one of the most reproduced images on earth, and whose legacy remains fiercely contested to this day. Che Guevara was the Argentine-born doctor turned Marxist guerrilla who helped lead the Cuban Revolution and then set out to spread it, a hero to some and a ruthless figure to others, admired and condemned with equal passion. In the autumn of 1967, while trying to ignite an uprising in the mountains of Bolivia, he was captured by soldiers and held in a schoolhouse, and there, on the 9th of October, he was executed. Facing the nervous young soldier who had been ordered to kill him, a man who hesitated with the rifle in his hands, Guevara is reported to have met the moment with cold defiance. "I know you have come to kill me," he said. "Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man." There is a chill in the sheer contempt of it. A condemned prisoner steadying his own executioner, refusing to grant death the satisfaction of his fear. The words are well recorded by those who studied his final days. His body was buried in a hidden, unmarked grave in the Bolivian earth and lost for 30 years, until his remains were finally found and returned to Cuba to be entombed here in Santa Clara, the site of his greatest victory. He had begun as a restless young medical student who rode a battered motorcycle across a continent and came home convinced that the poverty and injustice he had seen demanded revolution, and he had thrown himself into that conviction with a ferocity that carried him from the mountains of Cuba to a seat of power and then, restlessly again, back into the jungle to fight. To his admirers, he is a martyr and a saint of liberation, his bearded face on a red banner the most reproduced photograph in human history. To his critics, he is remembered for the executions he oversaw and the ruthlessness of his creed, and both of those truths have their fierce partisans still. Cornered at last in a Bolivian ravine and taken alive, he was held overnight in a village schoolroom, and the order came down to kill him and pretend he had died in battle. The soldier chosen for the task, it is said, was shaking, and it was to steady that trembling executioner that Guevara spat out his contemptuous command to shoot and be done with it. His captors photographed his body laid out on a stone slab, and the image, with its strange resemblance to a fallen saint, only deepened the legend they had hoped to end. They cut off his hands to prove his identity, and buried him in secret beneath an airstrip, where he lay lost for 3 decades, until searchers found the grave and brought him home to Cuba. He rests here now beneath the flame, an icon still argued over. Let us travel now to Lausanne, in Switzerland, to the Bois de Vaux cemetery, and a headstone carved with 5 lion heads, the grave of the woman who dressed the 20th century. Coco Chanel rose from an orphanage to build one of the most powerful empires in the history of fashion, freeing women from the corset, giving the world the little black dress and a perfume that still bears her name, ruling her domain with an iron will for more than half a century. She lived out her final decades in a grand suite at the Ritz Hotel in Paris. working almost to the end, for she dreaded idleness, and feared old age as she feared nothing else. She died on a Sunday, the 10th of January, 1971, at the age of 87. And she had always hated Sundays, because on Sundays the workrooms were closed and there was nothing to do. As the end came upon her that afternoon, she turned to her maid and spoke a last line of strange, detached observation, as if narrating the event to herself. "You see," she said, "this is how you die." There is a chill in that cool, clear-eyed commentary. The woman who had controlled every stitch of her own image, describing her own death like one final note dictated to an assistant. The words are attributed to her maid's recollection. By her own wish, she was not buried in Paris, but here in Lausanne, beneath a stone marked with those 5 carved lions, for she was born under the sign of the lion and wished, she said, to keep watch even from the grave. She had clawed her way up from a bleak provincial orphanage, where the severe lines and black and white of the nun's world would echo, some say, in the clothes she later designed, and she had remade the way women dressed, sweeping away the corsets and bustles that had caged them, and offering instead the freedom of jersey and trousers, and the timeless little black dress. Her perfume became the most famous scent in the world, and after the war, written off as finished at 70, she staged a triumphant comeback that sealed her legend. She was also a creature of iron routine who could not abide stillness, who dreaded the emptiness of old age and the silence of a Sunday when the ateliers were shut and there was nothing left to do but think about mortality. It was on just such a Sunday that death found her in her suite at the Ritz, the hotel that had been her home for 30 years. And her cool, almost clinical, last remark to her maid, narrating her own dying as though inspecting a hemline, is the perfect final gesture of a woman who had spent a lifetime controlling every detail of how the world saw her. She chose to be buried far from Paris, here in the Swiss city where she had lived after the war, beneath a stone she had marked with 5 carved lions' heads, one for the sign she was born under, so that she might go on watching over her empire even from the grave. She rests here now, still on guard. And so, friends, we come at last to the final grave of our long journey, and it belongs to a woman who turned a lifetime of pain into some of the most fearless art ever made, and who greeted her own death almost as a mercy. Let us travel to the Coyoacán district of Mexico City, to the famous Casa Azul, the blue house where she was born, where she lived, where she suffered and painted and loved, and where, in a sense, she remains to this day. Frida Kahlo endured a lifetime of physical agony, her body shattered as a teenager in a horrific bus accident, subjected to dozens of operations, racked with constant pain, and out of that suffering she forged a body of vivid, unflinching self-portraits that made her immortal. She died at the Casa Azul on the 13th of July, 1954, at the age of 47, officially of a pulmonary embolism, though some who knew her wondered whether, after so much pain, she had quietly chosen the hour of her release. And in her private diary, in what are taken to be among the last words she ever wrote, she left a farewell of dark and radiant hope, a single line that greets the end not with terror but with something like relief. "I hope the exit is joyful," she wrote, "and I hope never to return. There is a chill in it, and a strange beauty too. A woman who had borne the unbearable looking toward death as an open door and asking only that the leaving be joyful and the leaving be final." She was cremated, and her ashes were placed in a pre-Columbian urn that sits to this day within the Blue House, now a museum to her memory, so that she has never truly left the home she loved. Her whole life had been a long argument with pain. A childhood bout of polio had weakened one leg, and then, as a teenager, a horrific collision between the wooden bus she was riding and a streetcar drove an iron handrail clean through her body, breaking her spine and her pelvis, and condemning her to a lifetime of operations, plaster corsets, and unrelenting agony. Out of that suffering, she made art unlike anyone else's, fierce and tender self-portraits that stared her own broken body and stormy heart straight in the face, painted often while she lay flat on her back with a mirror above her and a canvas rigged over the bed. She loved and married and divorced and remarried the great muralist Diego Rivera, mourned the children she could not carry, and threw herself into political passion, and through all of it she painted. In her final year, after her leg was amputated, she wrote in her diary a line of startling courage about no longer needing feet because she had wings to fly. And on the last page, she left that radiant, unsettling farewell, greeting her exit as something to be hoped for and welcomed, asking only that the leaving be joyful and, this time, permanent. She did not want, she had said, to be buried lying down, having spent so much of her life flat on her back, and so she was cremated, and her ashes were placed in an urn that rests to this day upon a bed in the Blue House. She rests here now, at home forever, hoping never to return. And so, friends, our long walk through the country of last words draws to its close. Across 30 graves and 30 final sentences we have listened, again and again, for the sound of a human voice at its very last, and we have heard nearly every note a soul can strike on its way out of the world. We have heard the ironic and the defiant, the man who swore he had never felt better, and the general who mocked the enemy's aim, the queen who apologized to her executioner, and the philosopher who would not make new enemies at the end. We have heard the tender and the terrified, the ball player going to meet his lost love, and the founder of a nation making certain he would not be buried alive. We have heard the serene, the inventor gazing at something beautiful beyond the window, and the deaf composer promising himself he would hear in heaven. And we have heard the heartbroken, the painter whose sadness would last forever, and the poet toasting his own ruin. Some of these words were written down at once by careful witnesses, and some were softened and sharpened by legend across the centuries. And where I could, I have told you which was which. But notice, now that we stand at the end, that it has scarcely mattered. For the last word is the final seal. A life presses into the memory of the living, the closing line of the only story any of us ever truly writes. And we lean in to hear it precisely because we know, deep down, that a final sentence is waiting for each of us too, unwritten and unknown. We cannot choose ours, most likely. We cannot rehearse it or polish it or be sure it will be worthy of us. But these 30 souls, in all their irony and terror and grace, teach us at least to listen and to remember that every ordinary conversation might, without warning, hold someone's last. So we honor them the only way the dead can be honored, by keeping their voices alive a little longer, by speaking their final words aloud in the quiet and letting them land one more time. There is one last thing worth carrying home from this long walk. You will have noticed that the farewells grew harder to trust the further back in time we traveled, that the words of the movie stars and the inventor were written down by living witnesses within hours, while the words of the queens and the philosophers reach us across centuries, buffed and reshaped by every hand they pass through. And yet, standing here at the end of the road, I do not believe the difference matters quite as much as we might fear. For a last word, whether perfectly recorded or half-invented, is finally a kind of mirror, and what it reflects is not only the one who died, but all the rest of us, the living, gathered at the bedside and straining to hear. We keep the lines that feel true, the ones that seem to gather up a whole life and hand it back to us whole, and in choosing which farewells to treasure and which to let fall away, the living quietly confess what they believe, a life and a death ought to mean. So these 30 graves are, in their way, a portrait of us as much as of them, a record of the endings we find beautiful, and the ones we find chilling, and the ones we simply cannot stop repeating. Carry that thought gently with you when you go. Rest well, friends, all 30 of you, the famous and the infamous, the serene and the sorrowful, whatever secrets and whatever sadness and whatever final jokes you carried with you into the dark. And rest well to you too, my fellow travelers on this shadowed road, who walked the whole long way with me and listened. Hold your own words gently, and hold the ones you love a little closer, and until we walk together again, good night.